Picture this. You've just been offered a promotion at work. Exciting, right? Well, maybe not. It's a manager role, and you're wary. You've heard the stories. Aren't people getting harder to manage? Not to mention the headlines on manager burnout, layoffs. What about AI? How does that impact the job? Welcome to Piece of Work, the podcast that goes deep into what's behind today's workforce trends. Back in the day, the career ladder was simple. Start at the bottom, move up to manager, and eventually, if you're lucky, make it to the top. But these days, that ladder is looking way less stable. A lot of employees are saying, no thanks, I'll stay right here. In a study by the recruitment firm Robert Walters, 69% of Gen Z said middle management is too high stress and low reward. That number doesn't look great long term. Companies need a strong bench of up-and-comers ready to step in when mission-critical roles open up. These roles can take months to fill, and there's a cost to that gap. The Society for Human Resource Management says that for revenue-generating roles, companies could lose between $7,000 and $10,000 for each month they go unfilled. So what's going on here? Is the leadership pipeline running dry? In this episode, we unpack why high performers are passing on management and what leaders can do to turn it around. We're in luck. Our first guest today is Rachel Pacheco, organizational behavior expert and author of Bringing Up the Boss, a practical guide for new managers. Rachel, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
So happy to be here. Thanks, Eric.
Let's dive right in. Decline in leadership aspiration. What do you think is really behind it? Is it new, or are we finally just talking about it out loud?
Yeah, it's such an interesting point in time that we're in. So we've heard about kind of the Great Resignation, but what we're actually experiencing right now as well is what folks are calling the Great Flattening. Big companies, we're letting go of our middle managers. So we're removing that layer, often played by, the role played by millennials. We're flattening out organizations, and so we're removing these folks that have recently emerged as leaders and managers in organizations. What that's doing, right, is it's providing a signal to folks that, hey, we don't value you as a manager. We don't value leadership. We don't value kind of these middle managers who are really helping to bring junior people up and to, manage up to the more senior leaders. And so this great flattening with these layoffs is signaling to folks that, hey, we don't value you as a leader. And so then what does that do? Why would I then aspire to be a leader? Why would I aspire to be a manager if what I'm seeing all around me is that it's not valued? Let me tell you a little story. When my book Bringing Up the Boss came out, of course, like any author, you immediately read your reviews, and you immediately, you immediately go to the 2-star review and you fixate on that 2-star review, right? Of all of the, hundreds of wonderful reviews you get, you fixate on that one. And one that really stuck with me was this person who said, well, management, being a great manager, it's common sense, right? And I couldn't agree more. Great managers support their teams. They give effective feedback. They have hard conversations. They structure work well, right? These are all common sense things, but they're really, really hard to do, right? So we know what to do. We know, hey, to be a great manager, you need to give great feedback, but it's actually really hard to give effective, constructive feedback. And so I bring this up to say that companies promote these accidental managers or promote the superstar employee who's an individual contributor because we assume that being a great manager is just common sense. And so we're getting rid of managers with the great flattening. We're promoting people. We're putting people in these positions, these accidental manager positions, because we don't value how hard it actually is to be a great manager and the impact that really incredible managers have on teams and on organizations.
I mean, it's getting even harder, right? I mean, we all just, went through this extraordinary, challenging life-changing experience with the pandemic and how that changed how we all work, how we show up, our ability to physically show up, but then also the emotional requirements, the mental requirements, not only being a employee, but then if you are a leader of people, then what your requirement is to, guide your team members through this.
Twofold, right? First is that um, a vast majority of Gen Z workers expect their managers to, be responsible for their emotional and mental well-being, and more specifically, to have conversations about their mental health at work. So I'm an old millennial, um, and I would never have expected my manager 20 years ago when I first entered the workplace to have an in-depth conversation with me about my mental health. Um, right? It's just it's so foreign, right? But what we're having is Gen Z. Um, they expect their managers to be equipped to have these conversations. Furthermore, Gen Z expects their managers to actively bring more purpose and meaning into their work, something else that managers aren't trained to do. So, on one hand, we have these new demands of our managers. The second thing, which goes back to this, are fewer people aspiring to be leaders, aspiring to be managers. So many people entering kind of the managerial class now are part of the sandwich generation, right? We're taking care of young kids, and we're starting to take care of our aging parents, and so we are emotionally tapped out. I think about, in my 20s, as I was kind of rising through the ranks, how excited I was to manage people. I could not wait to manage individuals and to, be that resource for them. Now I think about management, and, in friends and colleagues, we have these discussions. You have to give so much of yourself as a manager, and that's emotionally exhausting. Our
Oh,
wells are
absolutely.
dry, right? In terms of, "Oh my gosh, I'm giving so much to my children. I'm also, caregiving to other family members, to my aging parents, and I have to give, in order to be a great manager, I also have to give that emotion, that time, that care, and that empathy to my employees. I can't juggle, those 3 things. Something has to go. Guess what I want? I want a team of 0. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, in the workforce from the sandwich generation who are emotionally tapped out.
So how does that career advancement and career progression look different in this sort of new world?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, the idea that not everyone needs or should be a manager in order to make a worthwhile contribution as they advance in their career. Are we fully communicating what the role entails? And can people raise their hand, to to either opt in or opt out, and not have it be held against them if they want to opt out because it's not for them? And I think it's important for organizations and for leaders to realize that, hey, not everyone might want to be a manager. Um, and actually, we don't want the people who don't want to do it, because it is a hard role, and because it is exhausting, right? And because it does take a lot. Um, and then for some other people, that's all they wanna do, right? I talk to so many people, so many young people, and you say, "Hey, what's your 1 or 2-year career goal?" They say, "I wanna be a manager," right? I wanna lead someone. I wanna manage a team." And that's incredible, and let's give those people the resources, the training, and the support so that then they don't 2 years later opt out because it's too exhausting, and they don't have the structural support to really thrive in that role.
Yeah, and You hit on that notion of the right training. What are you seeing in terms of that gap?
The organizations that do it best, they've made a they've made a fundamental shift, right, in terms of how they think about training managers. And that's, um, you know, managerial skills should be built far before anyone has a direct report.
Mhm.
And so these companies have shifted really into like I call it a culture of management. It's not the best term, but it's this idea that day one of someone's job, even an incredibly green employee, right? Green, fresh out of college, fresh out of high school, someone working, they can be building those managerial skills such that when they then have a direct report or they opt in to have a direct report, um, they're not starting to learn those skills when they have someone. That's the challenge, right? Is that even in companies that say, "Hey, we have a lot of management training," they're training managers once those managers already have teams, and that's too late, right? And so what great companies are doing is they're thinking, "Okay, well, what are the skills that a great
Mhm.
manager has?" They give, effective constructive feedback, right, in order for growth and development. They're able to manage conflict really well and work through conflict, repair conflict on teams, and encourage healthy conflict. They're able to have difficult conversations with individuals. Um, they're able to, uh, structure work in a way that's manageable and clear. So all of these things, we can learn all of these. Again, the very first day of our very first job, we can start learning these skills. And so then when we become a manager, we already have these foundational skills in place, and we start to apply them, to then, a single direct report. We start to apply them to a team, and we build our capabilities that way, as opposed to kind of when you get your direct report, then you start learning these skills. And that's, it's too late. People are already going to be miserable, if you don't have those skills.
Absolutely, and I think those core leadership principles apply, inside that culture and inside, the market and the business where they operate. I mean, there's just so many dynamics in there that, if an organization is not leaning in, there's a lot that can go sideways, or just not bring out the best of the employees, right? And that's in this world of how do we get more productivity and how do we go faster and how do we, sort of do all these things at an entirely different level. Um, that also becomes a revenue hit, a cost hit. I mean, there's so much inside that can affect an organization very, very negatively, and as well as the employee experience.
I was going to add one more thing too, right? And it's essentially what organizations want to do is they want to get to this virtuous cycle of management, right? Because if you think about the folks that end up becoming really exceptional managers, they've had an exceptional manager in the past. Right? And so they've seen the model, they see what works well, and they don't mimic what they do, because we all have kind of our authentic style of leading, um, but they're much more likely to be a great manager as well if they've had this role model. We're copying many of the mistakes that our managers have made. And so companies that invest in their managers, they're just by default investing in the next class of managers that are going to come up in 5, 8, 10 years, because role models are so important in terms of how we lead.
Absolutely, of course, I have to at least ask, one question, around the theme of the day, and maybe it's of this century, but where does AI play, in this?
It's going to make managers' jobs even more difficult, for people to find fulfilling and meaningful work, right? What we know is that as work gets easier, as we remove some of the productive friction of work,
Mhm.
right? This stuff that like we struggle with and it's hard, we're challenged by it, but then we have this, like, massive satisfaction when we figured it out. Um, AI removes a lot of that. It makes a lot of work easier, and what we know is that challenging hard work is some of the most meaningful work we have in our life. Our fundamental human need, right, is to find meaning and purpose in what we do, and AI puts that at risk because it makes things easier. It takes away a lot of that productive friction, that's hard, and so as managers, we have to think about, "Okay, how can I continue to challenge my employees? How can I continue to push my employees to learn when so much of their tasks or so many of their tasks are kind of mediated or supported by AI, which just makes things easier?" Um, and so it's hard. The other thing, kind of back to Gen Z, um, what we know about Gen Z is uh, there's they are a generation with kind of the highest rates of perfectionism, kind of,
Mm,
and which goes hand in hand with anxiety, right? So, like, there's
right.
there's there's perfectionism and anxiety coming to play. And so my concern as a leader, my concern as a professor in my classroom is that I need to challenge my employees. I need to challenge my students. But because of this massive fear of failure, this increase in perfectionism, plus the reliance on AI, that's a dual problem. Because, hey, if I can't think of the idea, I can ask AI for that idea. So I'm never gonna come to class, or I'm never gonna come to a meeting with my boss and say, "I couldn't figure this out," or "I couldn't come up with an idea," or "I couldn't come up with a new solution." Because even if they're bad, AI is gonna produce something, right? And so
So
I'm
true.
right? So I'm never gonna have that experience of, like, coming to a meeting without anything, or saying, "I couldn't figure it out." Because, again, even if it's wrong, I will have something. So that risk of failing continues to decrease alongside this kind of perfectionism.
Yeah, it's a super fascinating take. To be honest, I haven't thought about it in exactly that way, right? Because there's so much of the hard, tedious, busy, frictiony stuff that we're so excited for AI to take. But to your point, then when you sort of clear that deck and you're really staring into, and the load is lighter. Again, it puts that notion of meaning and the work that you really are meant to do and you care about doing, and but that you still need a certain amount of friction, and you still need problem and breaking through it. And so what do you tell HR teams right now in terms of how they can support the next generation of leaders?
Always the first thing I focus on is this idea of, can you start to build leadership skills? Can you start to build management skills from the very first day of someone's very first job, right? And think about embedding those skills. It doesn't have to be formal training. It can be informal, informal modes of learning. But how can you start getting people to practice these really critical skills? Again, resolving conflict, having hard feedback, structuring work effectively, um, having difficult conversations, right? Can you start building those the very first day of someone's very first job? And, back to this idea of perfectionism, we know we have a generation of folks who are petrified of failing and don't want to take risks because of kind of the anxiety and focus on perfectionism. Um, Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation, talks about why, like, why do these younger folks have so much of this anxiety and perfectionism? Um, and in some ways, we both have to make them allow them to fail in the workplace, and we have to make sure we're giving them the tools and the resources early on, so that they feel like they're competent and they're going to be capable in those roles. Um, so I think that's the first thing, right? Like, how can you start building these skills really early on? And I think the second thing, which goes back to this conversation about AI that we're having. As I think HR, the people ops and in HR groups can play a role in helping leaders and helping organizations think about how can we effectively challenge our employees.
Rachel showed us why so many new managers struggle and what it takes to help them succeed. But what does that look like on the ground, especially in places like retail, manufacturing, healthcare, where frontline managers face tough challenges every day and it's never easy to find your next leader? Well, that's where our next guest comes in. Dan Staley is an HR expert with PwC who's worked closely with frontline teams for over a decade. He's here to help us understand why fewer of today's workers want management roles and what companies can do about it. Okay, Dan, welcome. Thank you for joining the podcast. Exciting to spend some time with you. We're talking today about the shrinking pool of workers who want to become managers. How do you see that playing out across frontline industries like retail, manufacturing, or hospitality?
Well, I think it's certainly an issue, and I think organizations are, in some cases, starting to address that. But I think, especially in the retail space where I work a lot within PwC, we're finding that a lot of the job has gotten more complex, and there hasn't been a lot more pay or flexibility. So you've got these workers who are they're having to, man the registers and restock inventory and, handle sort of customer escalations. And I think there's more and more of that these days. And at the same time, they're playing HR roles. They're interviewing, they're hiring, training, scheduling, having to focus on compliance. So there's a lot asked of them, and I do think that we're seeing fewer and fewer people seeing that that's worth the dollars that they're paid. So I do think it is a issue for sure. It's the work can be kind of grueling, right?
I would imagine um, many of these frontline managers probably feel fairly kind of ill-equipped to be able to handle that. Is that what's your view?
Part of the issues is they don't have a lot of support, or in many cases they don't have a lot of support. Um, from kind of the mothership or from the corporate office. I mean, I think there's a lot of organizations that put a lot of stock in making sure that, the storefront or the front line are taken care of. But I think it goes without saying that that direct conversation, like I think when we talk about, you ask with the retail workers where they get their information or how often they rely on corporate websites or corporate communications, it's not a lot. Most of what they glean are from their store managers, and so that role is pretty critical, and plays a huge part of keeping the workforce engaged. But then the question to you alluded to is who's sort of taking care of those managers? Like, what support are they getting, given these kind of enhanced roles that they're playing and all these things kind of being thrown at them? These are $1 million enterprises, and they want them to act as owners. And so in this case, they're stock options and stock grants. And I think with all of the perks and benefits, I think I read the pay up to 400K. I mean, certainly well over six figures. And that I think is what it's going to take. I think to get people to kind of want to do these jobs is to create them more as owners, where they're incented. And I think one of the things that we encourage organizations to do is to really look at the different personas that you have, and basically, because not everybody is the same and people are in the business for different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely, and um, because a lot of those challenges that you hit on to be addressed, I would imagine also, like when we think about just sort of post pandemic, would have accelerated quite a bit, right? Because as you well noted, earlier in the conversation, particularly when you think about retail or manufacturing, hospitality, a number of these, um, there's not that work from home option. Are you seeing, in terms of just trends, that there are less, frontline workers kind of raising their hands to be people leaders?
Well, I think certainly the they've got to see that the opportunities and the rewards are there. So I think you'll see in some cases where um, managers don't make that much more. I had a friend whose son worked at one of the grocery chains, and they did have some upward mobility where if you stayed there X number of years, you could start to make some real money. But in the short term, becoming a supervisor, I didn't know that it came with any extra pay. I mean, maybe it was a dollar or two more an hour. It wasn't much for a lot of extra responsibility of getting in early and opening up or closing out or dealing with the hassles of sort of managing the team. And so I think the first thing is organizations have to make that next level, that management level, worth the extra time. There was a PwC, recent hopes and fears survey where employees, I think 60% felt like they really weren't being paid enough, in those roles for what they had to do. I think the flexibility is the other side of it. I mean, that's again a retail challenge where there's not a lot of options. I think to your other point you alluded on is certainly some of it is the skills. So having access to the skills, getting that training, and growing again for that cohort that wants to advance, making those opportunities, available to them.
If there's one or two things when you think about HR or operational leaders, that maybe they should reconsider in terms of how they support frontline leaders, what do you think?
The probably most important thing I think you could do is really just spend the time listening to them and understanding those issues, and then trying to craft solutions that are more unique to them. When we kind of look at what the employees are wanting, it's it's compensation is top. It's skill. I want skills and maybe career advancement and just new opportunities. It's additional flexibility, maybe additional PTO. I mean, so and that may not be the same for everybody. That's why I think looking at breaking it in, doing the surveys, breaking it into a couple different cohorts, understanding what those cohorts want, understanding the percent of people you have that are in those cohorts, and really crafting a strategy that appeals to each one of them versus maybe, oh, this is what I think everybody wants, and understanding that everybody's in a different place. You've got some people who are, certainly on the front line who are going to be older, and they're going to be, right, they're going to be in their 40s and 50s or thinking about different things than maybe the 19-year-old is. So, and I think that's important to really understand where each person is and each cohort is.
I loved speaking with Rachel and Dan on how we can find and support the next generation of managers. Here's what they taught me about this important piece of work. First, rethink the path. If we want more and better managers, make leadership a role with structure, support, and room to grow. Give managers trusted data and training in the flow of work so the job feels doable, not endless. Second, build real non-manager careers, not as a consolation prize, but as a path to influence, impact, and recognition. On the front line especially, don't ask people to trade more stress for the same pay. Reward the work, not just the headcount. Third, make succession a system, not a scramble. Start early. Surface potential, not just past performance. Teach leadership skills before someone gets their first direct report, so stepping up feels like a next step, not a cliff. Bottom line, don't push everyone into management. Redesign the path. Support the people. Make leadership a choice worth making. Thank you for listening to Piece of Work. I'm Eric Glass. If you've enjoyed the show, let us know what you think on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.